You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
So most of the Mishnah of Ketubot is really about money. I mean, there's some about the conduct of the marriage, but the vast majority is about money and inheritance of possessions and kind of what happens if one party dies or divorces. And that's very much the content of the 8th chapter. But as we get closer to the end, we start to get into questions which are a little bit more emotional, at least at one point, at least in the 5th Mishnah. Naflula avadim ushfachot. So she inherited slaves or maidservants. Well, the text says they came to her. But I'm assuming that I think she probably inherits them. Well, we'll see from the context, she's probably inherited them. The old ones are to be sold. This might be what you do with a slave when they can't work anymore, a bit like an old car. You get rid of them, you sell them. And you can see, by the way, that the husband might want to do this because once they're sold, then that's part of the wife's capital, but he can enjoy the income for the duration of the marriage. So as far as his income producing position is concerned, that's better. And of course, in terms of his expenses, well, he doesn't have to support them. So you can see why the husband might want to sell the old slaves. And that's the first opinion in the Mishnah. Hazakenim yimacharu. The old ones are to be sold off. V'ilakach b'hem karka, and money, the money spent on land, we've seen this before. V'hu ochel perot, and he gets the income. That's the first opinion in the Mishnah. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, now remember, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel comes from just about the oldest and most famous family in Israel. In fact, he's quite sensitive about his own honor. Okay, so Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Lo timkor mipnei shehen kavod beit aviha. She should not sell them because they are the honor of her father's house. These old servants, these old slaves, they're part of their family retinue. You can't just throw them into the slave market. It's like throwing them onto the junkie. And by the way, the halacha goes according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel in this Mishnah. There's something about these old connections that transcends the financial interests of certainly of the husband. Perhaps it seems to be up to the wife. Lotin core, she clearly has the option of not selling them. Let's carry on. There's a mirror image. We've seen many of these Mishnayot, right? They come in two halves and they're mirror images. So let's just go through the mirror image. Naflula zeitim ukfanim. So she inherited olive trees or vines. And these, by the way, also go to, like servants, these grow to a great age. Very common now, buy wine from 60-year-old vines. You very often see olive trees that are hundreds of years old. So these are trees that grow to a great age. Naflula zeitim ukfanim hazkenim yimacharu la'etzim. So the older ones are to be sold for wood. Ve'yakach b'hem karka, and land purchased with the proceeds. Ve'hu ochel perot, and the husband can enjoy the income. Again, it's quite clear that the financial benefit from this sale is the husband's. It's not the wife's. And Rabbi Yudah is going to come along and defend the interests of the wife's family. Rabbi Yudah Omer, Rabbi Judah is going to say, just like Rabban Gamliel, not in core, she should not sell. Mipnei shehen shvach beit aviha. They are the glory of her father's house. There's something about the ancestral possessions that it carries an emotional significance. We don't let it go that easily, even if the husband wants to let it go. What if he actually spends money? What if he has to spend money keeping all this stuff up? Okay, well, that maybe there the situation's a bit different. So someone who spends money on his wife's property, maybe keeping up her old vines or her old maidservants. We don't know. I mean, this Mishnah seems to be connected. So someone's spending money on his wife's property. Whether he spent much and consumed little. Kim'ah is a rare word, and sometimes it's spelled with an I, but it means little. So whether he spent much and consumed little. Maybe he spent little and ate and consumed a lot. Either way, he can't basically make any claim. No, we're not going to try and value both sides of the bargain. Basically, what he spent, and what he's consumed. We don't make an account. If he spent and did not consume, okay, so at that point, maybe at the end of the marriage, he can take something back. He should swear how much he spent and take. And that's the traditional Torah oath that you make over essentially any financial claim, that a financial claim that doesn't have witnesses, you can make an oath and that's considered, it stands up in court anyway. So that's, but only when the situation is clear. So when there's no question of balancing what he spent to what he took, if it's just a question of what he spent, he can just swear an oath. And the Gemara, by the way, goes on to say that he has to spend this money so as to increase the value of the property. By the way, they value the property before and after the expenditure. And if the property's only gone up in value by 75 shekel, but he spent 100 shekel, well, he can only claim 75. So he can claim what he spent, but only to the extent that it is actually inflating the value of the property. Now, what if all this happens to a woman whose status is indeterminate? And at the beginning of the chapter, we learned about the woman who was betrothed or who acquired money just before her marriage. And then we contrasted it with a woman who acquired possessions after her marriage. And now we're going to deal with a woman who acquires money while she's waiting for Yibum. So her husband is dead, but she hasn't yet performed chalitza or Yibum with her husband's brother, with her brother-in-law. The presumption is that her husband died childless. And this Mishnah, by the way, we've already learned. We learned it in Yevamot. It's in the 4th chapter of Yevamot. We learned it quite fast, I think, in Yevamot. Yevamot is such a complicated masechet. We have our eye on other things. So it's good to come back to it. Shomeret yavam shenaflu lam nechasim. So a woman awaiting Yibum who inherited possessions. Same style. Clearly, by the way, this Mishnah belongs in Ketubot, not in Yevamot. It fits chapter 8 absolutely perfectly. So she's awaiting Yibum, she's inherited something. Modin Beit Shammai Beit Hillel shehi mocheret v'notenet v'kayam. So Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel agree that she can sell it or give it, and her act is valid. In other words, the fact that she's waiting for Yibum doesn't constrain her legal rights to dispose of her property, just as any other widow could dispose of her property. I mean, the fact that she's waiting for Yibum constrains her ability to marry somebody else. So she has some very specific constraints in that department, but she can deal with her property as she likes. So the Mishnah then asks, what if she dies? Meta, she dies. Maya said ketuvata. What are we going to do with her ketubah? Because she owns the ketubah from her dead husband. And what about all the possessions that came into the marriage with her and left the marriage with her? So what are we going to do with all this stuff? Because she's in this rather indeterminate position between, perhaps, I mean, if her husband had just died, then normally and she's childless. We assume she's childless, right? Because the husband's childless, so she must be childless. So normally her father, a woman dies, she has no children, her husband's dead, her father will inherit her. On the other hand, if she's married, she dies, she has no children, Well, her husband will inherit her, or if her husband's dead, her husband's heirs will inherit her. So a husband heir, by the way, in this case, might be the husband's living brother. Might be, could be. So she's kind of caught between her father and her husband's, let's say her husband's family. Who's going to inherit? Okay. Beit Shammai omrim yachaloku yorshei habal im yorshei ha'av. So Beit Shammai say, look, let's just split everything halfway down. We'll split it half and half. The inheritors of her father will split with the inheritors of her husband. So the presumption must be here that her father inherits her, but he must be dead, right? So essentially, the inheritors of her father are probably her brothers, actually. So Beit Shammai say, let's split. Uveit Hillel omrim. Beit Hillel are going to be a bit more complex. Nechasim keches katan. The possessions go according to where they are located. So, uketubah b'cheskat yorshei habal. The ketubah essentially is assumed to be with the inheritors of the husband, because the husband's holding the ketubah. I think the presumption is the husband is still holding the ketubah. So that's where the ketubah is. So it goes in that direction. And property that kind of came in from her family and goes out with her family at the end of the marriage, that is assumed to be with the inheritors of her father, i.e. with her family. So that is how Beit Hillel divide the possession, and halakha actually goes according to Beit Hillel.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.